The leather-bound first edition of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations sat pristine on the mahogany desk, its gold-embossed title gleaming under the crystal chandelier of the Whitmore Industries boardroom. Vincent Whitmore III adjusted his Italian silk tie and smirked as he watched the night janitor through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The man was methodically cleaning the hallway, his weathered hands gripping a worn mop handle with the same careful attention most people reserved for precious objects. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Vincent had built his empire on a simple philosophy. People revealed their true nature when they thought nobody was watching. At 45, he controlled a media conglomerate worth $3 billion, inherited from his father and grandfather before him. The Whitmore name commanded respect in Manhattan's elite circles, and Vincent wore that legacy like armor against a world he viewed with calculating suspicion. The janitor's name was Marcus Chen, though Vincent had never bothered to learn it. To him, the elderly man was simply part of the building's furniture, invisible and insignificant. But tonight, Vincent had orchestrated something that would satisfy his need to prove a point that had been nagging at him for weeks. Marcus Chen pushed his cleaning cart down the polished marble corridor of the 62nd floor, his soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the gleaming surface. At 71, his movements were deliberate rather than hurried, each motion refined by decades of invisible labor in buildings where his presence was expected but never acknowledged. The gray uniform he wore was impeccably maintained despite its obvious age, pressed crisp each morning in the small apartment he shared with his daughter's family in Queens. The late October wind rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows as Marcus approached the executive boardroom. Through the glass, he could see Vincent Whitmore III seated at the head of an enormous conference table, apparently reviewing documents. The man's tailored suit probably cost more than Marcus earned in 6 months, yet Marcus felt no resentment. He had learned long ago that bitterness was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Interesting reading material," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected quality that made Vincent look up sharply. "I wouldn't expect you to be familiar with classical philosophy," Vincent replied, his tone carrying just enough condescension to establish the proper distance between them. "It requires a certain level of education to appreciate." Marcus continued his cleaning, but his movements had taken on a different quality, more deliberate somehow. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations as personal reflections, never intending them for publication. It's remarkable how his private thoughts on virtue and mortality became one of the foundational texts of Stoic philosophy. The words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. Vincent's carefully constructed assumptions wavered for just a moment before his defensive instincts reasserted themselves. The janitor was clearly parroting something he had heard or perhaps half-remembered from a documentary. Such people often developed fragments of knowledge without true understanding. "Anyone can memorize a few facts from Wikipedia," Vincent said, his voice carrying a sharper edge. "True appreciation requires years of proper education, exposure to the broader context of philosophical thought. It's not something you pick up from cleaning offices." Marcus straightened slowly, his cleaning forgotten for the moment. Something in his posture had changed, a subtle shift that suggested depths Vincent hadn't expected. "You're absolutely right that context matters." Aurelius was writing during the Antonine Plague, watching his empire struggle with both external threats and internal corruption. His reflections on mortality weren't abstract philosophical exercises. They were the thoughts of a man watching his world crumble while trying to maintain his moral center. Vincent felt an unexpected chill. The janitor's response demonstrated not just surface knowledge but genuine understanding, the kind that came from serious engagement with the text. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. The script he had imagined called for embarrassed silence, perhaps fumbling attempts to seem knowledgeable. Not this quiet, confident analysis that revealed uncomfortable depths. "You seem to know quite a bit about books for someone in your position," Vincent said, recovering his composure and injecting calculated cruelty into his observation. "Though I suppose you're too poor to actually own anything like this." The words were designed to wound, to re-establish the proper hierarchy that Marcus's unexpected knowledge had threatened. Vincent gestured toward the rare edition with proprietary satisfaction, making clear the vast gulf between ownership and mere familiarity. The book represented not just monetary value but cultural capital, the kind of refined possession that marked the boundaries between classes. Marcus looked at the book for a long moment, then back at Vincent. Something had shifted in his expression, a subtle hardening around the eyes that suggested Vincent had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. "You're right, Mr. Whitmore. I am too poor to own a first edition worth $30,000. Vincent smiled with satisfaction, pleased that the janitor at least understood his place in the world's natural order. But Marcus wasn't finished speaking. "However," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a quality that made Vincent's smile falter, "I am familiar with this particular edition. It was published by Reeves and Turner in London, part of their Philosophical Classics series. The binding work was done by Sangorski and Sutcliffe, which explains the gold tooling on the spine. What makes this edition particularly valuable isn't just its age, but the fact that it includes the translator's notes that were omitted from later printings." Vincent stared at the janitor, his carefully constructed sense of superiority beginning to crack. This level of detail went far beyond casual knowledge. Marcus was demonstrating the kind of expertise that came from serious study, the very expertise Vincent had assumed was impossible for someone in his position. "The translation itself is by George Long," Marcus continued, seemingly unaware of Vincent's growing discomfort. "Not the best available today, of course. Robin Hard's more recent work captures the nuances of Aurelius's Greek more effectively. But Long's version has historical significance as one of the first widely accessible English translations." The boardroom fell silent except for the whisper of wind against the windows. Vincent found himself speechless, his assumptions unraveling with each demonstration of Marcus's knowledge. This wasn't supposed to happen. The script he had written in his mind called for the janitor to be intimidated, embarrassed, put firmly in his place. Instead, Vincent was the one feeling exposed. "Where did you learn all this?" Vincent asked, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. Marcus resumed his cleaning, but his movements now carried a different quality, as if he were performing a role rather than simply working. "The same place you did, Mr. Whitmore, though perhaps we took different paths to arrive there." The cryptic response only deepened Vincent's confusion and growing unease. He had expected to prove the janitor's intellectual limitations, to confirm his own superiority through contrast. Instead, he found himself questioning assumptions he had never thought to examine. The natural order he had always taken for granted suddenly seemed less certain. "I doubt we received our education from the same institutions," Vincent said, attempting to reassert control through appeals to social hierarchy. "I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, then completed my MBA at Wharton. Family tradition, you understand. 3 generations of Whitmores have shaped American media from those halls." Marcus nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Harvard has an excellent philosophy department. Did you study under Professor Richardson?" "Her work on Stoic ethics is quite impressive." Vincent felt another uncomfortable jolt. Professor Richardson had indeed been one of his instructors, though he had paid little attention to her classes, viewing philosophy as merely another requirement to be fulfilled on his path to inheriting the family business. The janitor's casual familiarity with Harvard faculty suggested connections that challenged Vincent's understanding of the world's proper order. "You seem remarkably well-informed for someone who cleans buildings for a living," Vincent said, unable to keep a defensive edge from his voice. Marcus paused in his work, straightening to look directly at Vincent for the first time in their conversation. His dark eyes held depths that Vincent had never noticed before, intelligence, and perhaps something else that made the younger man uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said quietly, "may I ask you something?" Vincent nodded, though he sensed he was walking into territory he hadn't mapped. "Why did you leave that book positioned exactly where you knew I would notice it? And why have you been watching me so intently while I work?" The question struck Vincent like a physical blow. His carefully orchestrated test had been transparent to its intended victim, his manipulations obvious and crude. The sophisticated trap he had imagined revealed itself as the petty scheme of someone whose privilege had blinded him to the intelligence of others. "I was curious," Vincent admitted, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "I wanted to see how you would react to something valuable, something intellectual." Marcus nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had long suspected. "You wanted to test whether I knew my place." The simple statement carried more weight than any accusation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Vincent found himself face to face with the ugliness of his own assumptions, the casual cruelty of his experiment laid bare. He had treated another human being as a specimen to be studied, an object whose reactions might provide entertainment or confirmation of his own superiority. "I apologize," Vincent said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. That was inappropriate. Marcus resumed his cleaning, but his demeanor had changed. The earlier deference was gone, replaced by something that resembled pity more than anger. "Mr. Whitmore, in my experience, when someone feels the need to prove their superiority, it usually indicates they're not as secure in their position as they pretend to be." The observation hit with surgical precision. Vincent felt his face flush with a combination of embarrassment and anger. How dare this janitor, this nobody, psychoanalyze him? Yet even as his indignation rose, he recognized the accuracy of the assessment. His need to test Marcus had indeed sprung from some deeper insecurity, some nagging doubt about the foundations of his identity. "You don't know anything about my position," Vincent said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I control a $3 billion empire. I have influence you couldn't imagine. Whatever education you might have had, whatever books you might have read, at the end of the day, you're still pushing a mop for minimum wage." Marcus stopped cleaning entirely now, setting down his supplies with deliberate care. When he looked at Vincent again, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. The earlier patience was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that made Vincent suddenly aware of how alone they were in the empty building. "You're absolutely right," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new quality that made Vincent's earlier confidence waver. "I do push a mop for minimum wage. I have for 15 years now, ever since I arrived in this country. And you're correct that your family controls a media empire worth billions of dollars. These are facts, Mr. Whitmore, but facts can be deceptive things." Vincent felt an inexplicable chill. Something in Marcus's tone suggested depths he hadn't suspected, currents running beneath the surface that might prove dangerous to disturb. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down now, not when his superiority had been challenged by someone so clearly beneath his station. "Deceptive how?" Vincent asked, though part of him no longer wanted to know the answer. Marcus walked slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the glittering Manhattan skyline. The city spread below them like a circuit board, each light representing lives and fortunes and dreams. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried clearly in the silence of the empty boardroom. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, what do you know about the acquisition your company made 18 months ago? The purchase of Chen Digital Media Group?" Vincent felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. Chen Digital had been a significant acquisition, an Asian media conglomerate that had given Whitmore Industries crucial access to emerging markets. The purchase had been complex, involving multiple holding companies and shell corporations, but it had ultimately been successful. What did the janitor know about high-level corporate acquisitions? "That was a successful expansion of our Asian market presence," Vincent said carefully, though his earlier confidence was rapidly evaporating. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, it was quite successful. The seller received approximately $1.2 billion for assets that included television networks, digital media platforms, and a significant publishing house. It was, by all accounts, an excellent deal for Whitmore Industries." Vincent stared at Marcus, a terrible suspicion beginning to form in his mind. The janitor's knowledge of the acquisition's details was far too specific, too intimate. These weren't facts that would be available to casual observers or even most industry analysts. They were the kind of details known only to those directly involved in the negotiations. "How do you know about the specifics of that deal?" Vincent asked, though he was no longer sure he wanted to hear the answer. Marcus turned from the window, and in the dim light of the boardroom, Vincent saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. The weathered face and work-worn hands remained, but something else had emerged. A quality of authority that transformed his entire presence. This wasn't the invisible janitor Vincent had dismissed for years. This was someone else entirely. "Because, Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said quietly, "I was the seller." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin around him as the implications cascaded through his mind. The janitor who had been cleaning his offices for 15 years, the man he had just mocked for being too poor to own books, was the former owner of a billion-dollar media empire. "That's impossible," Vincent whispered, though even as he spoke, pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus's knowledge of books, his familiarity with Harvard faculty, his understanding of complex philosophical concepts, these weren't the accomplishments of someone who had always been a janitor. They were the marks of someone who had once moved in Vincent's own social circles. Marcus reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small leather wallet. From it, he extracted a business card, yellowed with age but still legible. He placed it on the conference table where Vincent could see it clearly. The card read, "Marcus Chen, Chairman and CEO, Chen Digital Media Group." Vincent stared at the card as if it were a snake that might strike. Everything he thought he knew about the world, about social hierarchies, about his own position in the natural order, was crumbling around him. The man he had just humiliated, had just declared too poor to own books, had once controlled an empire that rivaled his own family's holdings. "But why?" Vincent asked, his voice barely audible. "Why are you working as a janitor? What happened to the money?" Marcus pocketed the business card and resumed cleaning, but his movements now carried a different significance. He wasn't just a janitor performing menial labor. He was a former titan of industry, who had chosen invisibility for reasons Vincent couldn't begin to understand. "That, Mr. Whitmore, is a much longer story," Marcus said. "One that begins with choices your grandfather made 70 years ago and ends with choices I made 15 years ago. Choices that were always going to lead us to this moment, in this room, with you learning that the man you just mocked as too poor to read once owned the very building we're standing in." Vincent felt the blood drain from his face. The building housing Whitmore Industries headquarters was leased, not owned. The actual owner was listed as a holding company with ties that Vincent had never bothered to investigate. The implications of Marcus's words were staggering. "You own this building?" Vincent asked, though the question came out as more of a croak. Marcus nodded calmly. "Among others. 15 buildings in Manhattan, actually, plus various properties in Hong Kong, Singapore, and London. The holding company that manages them is very discreet, which allows me to work in them without attracting attention." The revelation struck Vincent like a physical blow. For 15 years, he had been paying rent to the man he employed as a janitor. The cosmic irony was so complete, so devastating, that Vincent felt his carefully constructed worldview finally collapse entirely. "This doesn't make sense," Vincent said, desperation creeping into his voice. "If you own all this, if you have all that money, why are you working as a janitor? Why subject yourself to this?" Marcus finished wiping down the conference table and began gathering his supplies. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world to explain how Vincent's universe had just been turned upside down. "Patience, Mr. Whitmore. As I said, it's a long story, and we've only just reached the beginning. The real question isn't why I chose to become invisible after selling my company. The real question is what I discovered while I was invisible, and what I plan to do with that knowledge." Vincent felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the windows. Something in Marcus's tone suggested that this revelation was merely the opening move in a game whose rules Vincent didn't understand, and whose stakes he was only beginning to grasp. "What do you mean?" Vincent asked, though he sensed he was walking deeper into territory that might prove dangerous. Marcus paused at the boardroom door, his cleaning cart positioned beside him like a prop in an elaborate theater performance. When he looked back at Vincent, his expression carried a weight that made the younger man's earlier arrogance seem pathetically naive. "I mean, Mr. Whitmore, that for 15 years I have been watching, listening, and learning. I have seen how your family operates when they think no one important is paying attention. I have observed the casual cruelty, the systematic exploitation, the breathtaking arrogance that comes from generations of unearned privilege, and I have been documenting it all." Vincent felt his mouth go dry. The implications of Marcus's words were staggering. A former media mogul with vast resources and intimate knowledge of the industry had spent 15 years gathering intelligence on the Whitmore family's business practices. The potential for damage was incalculable. "Tonight," Marcus continued, "when you decided to test my intelligence, when you mocked me as too poor to read, You crossed a line that I had been hoping you wouldn't cross. You revealed something about your character that I had suspected but never confirmed. And that changes everything." Vincent tried to speak, but no words came. He felt like a man who had pulled what he thought was a harmless prank, only to discover he had detonated a bomb that would destroy everything he had ever known. Marcus pushed his cart toward the door, then paused one final time. "Your great-grandfather built his fortune by cheating my grandfather out of a mining claim in California. Your grandfather expanded that fortune by stealing my father's newspaper chain through fabricated debt instruments. And your father completed the family tradition by attempting to destroy my company with corporate espionage and market manipulation." Each revelation hit Vincent like a physical blow. Family history he had never known, or had chosen not to know, was being laid bare by someone who had every reason to seek revenge. "I came to America with nothing but the clothes on my back and a determination to rebuild what your family had stolen from mine," Marcus continued. "It took me 30 years to create an empire that rivaled yours, and when I sold it, I made a choice that you would never understand. I chose to use my wealth not for display or self-aggrandizement, but for justice." Vincent found his voice at last, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What kind of justice?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time all evening the expression was neither kind nor patient. It was the smile of someone who had been planning for a very long time and was finally ready to act. "The kind that your family has managed to avoid for 3 generations, Mr. Whitmore. The kind that comes not from courts or regulators, but from the simple application of truth. Your empire was built on lies, theft, and exploitation. Tomorrow morning, the world is going to learn exactly how the Whitmore family fortune was really accumulated." Vincent felt the room spinning around him. "You can't prove any of those things. Whatever you think you know, it happened decades ago. There's no evidence." Marcus's smile widened. "Oh, but there is, Mr. Whitmore. You see, when you own the buildings where your enemies work, when you have access to their offices during the quiet hours of the night, when you're invisible to them for 15 years, you learn remarkable things. Your family has been remarkably careless with their records, remarkably careless with their private conversations, remarkably careless with their assumption that the help doesn't matter." The full scope of Vincent's situation began to dawn on him. Marcus hadn't just been cleaning offices for 15 years. He had been conducting the most comprehensive corporate espionage operation in history. With unlimited resources, complete access, and absolute invisibility, he had been gathering evidence of decades of criminal activity. "The documents I've collected tell a fascinating story," Marcus continued. "Stock manipulation, bribery, tax evasion, corporate fraud spanning 3 generations. But the real masterpiece is the recording I made 6 months ago of your father's conversation with Senator Morrison about the media regulation bill. The one where they discussed how much his vote would cost and how to structure the payments through your charity foundation." Vincent felt his legs give out. He sank into the nearest chair as the magnitude of his family's exposure became clear. The conversation Marcus described could destroy not just their business empire, but could send multiple family members to prison for decades. "What do you want?" Vincent asked, his voice hollow with defeat. Marcus pushed his cart through the doorway, then looked back one final time. "I want what your family took from mine, Mr. Whitmore. Everything. Your company, your wealth, your reputation, your legacy. I want to watch it all crumble, just as mine did 70 years ago. The only difference is, this time, it will be deserved." As Marcus disappeared down the hallway, Vincent sat alone in the boardroom, surrounded by the trappings of inherited wealth and power that now seemed as fragile as soap bubbles. The rare book that had started this conversation sat on the table before him, its gold-embossed title catching the light. He picked it up with trembling hands and read the inscription on the first page, words he had never noticed before. "To my dear friend Marcus, may you find wisdom in adversity and strength in justice. Professor Richardson, Harvard University, class of 1982. Vincent stared at the inscription, the final piece falling into place. Marcus hadn't just been familiar with Professor Richardson's work. He had been her student, just as Vincent claimed to have been. But, unlike Vincent, Marcus had actually paid attention, had actually learned, had actually understood the philosophical principles that Vincent had dismissed as academic nonsense. The book slipped from Vincent's nerveless fingers, falling to the marble floor with a sound like thunder. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered in the darkness, 3 billion points of light representing the empire his family had controlled for 3 generations. But Vincent knew, with the cold certainty of absolute defeat, that by tomorrow night, those lights would belong to someone else. Someone who had spent 15 years learning that true power didn't come from inherited wealth or social position. It came from patience, intelligence, and the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. The janitor's response to being mocked as too poor to read was going to bankrupt the entire Whitmore bloodline, and there was absolutely nothing Vincent could do to stop it. Vincent Whitmore III didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse apartment, overlooking Central Park, surrounded by the artifacts of generational wealth that now felt more like museum pieces marking an extinct civilization. The handcrafted furniture, the original paintings, the shelves lined with rare books he had never actually read, all of it seemed to mock him with its impermanence. By dawn, Vincent had consumed half a bottle of his father's finest whiskey and filled a legal pad with frantic notes, desperate strategies, and increasingly implausible escape plans. None of them would work. Marcus Chen held all the cards, and Vincent was beginning to understand that this game had been rigged from the moment the former janitor had first entered the Whitmore building 15 years ago. The phone calls started at 7:30 in the morning. Vincent's personal assistant, Sandra, sounded panicked even through the professional veneer she maintained regardless of circumstances. "Mr. Whitmore, we have a situation. The SEC has announced an investigation into Whitmore Industries' financial practices dating back 20 years. They're also indicating that criminal referrals may be forthcoming." Vincent closed his eyes, feeling the noose tighten around his family's legacy. What triggered the investigation? Anonymous tips, apparently. Someone provided them with extensive documentation of irregularities in our reporting, evidence of market manipulation, and recordings of conversations that should never have been recorded. Sandra's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Sir, they have recordings of your father discussing bribes with Senator Morrison. Audio quality is perfect, like they were made with professional equipment." The whiskey Vincent had consumed turned to acid in his stomach. Marcus hadn't been bluffing. Somehow, the man who had pushed a cleaning cart through their offices for 15 years had managed to record private conversations in supposedly secure locations. The technical sophistication required for such an operation suggested resources and planning that went far beyond simple revenge. "There's more," Sandra continued. "The Times, the Post, and the Journal have all received comprehensive packets of information about the family's business practices. Their investigative teams are apparently working around the clock to verify the documents, but early indications suggest everything is authentic." Vincent felt the room spinning around him. In less than 12 hours, Marcus had triggered simultaneous investigations by federal regulators, criminal prosecutors, and every major newspaper in the country. The coordination required for such an assault indicated years of preparation and connections that reached into the highest levels of government and media. "Cancel everything on my schedule," Vincent said, his voice hollow. "And get my father on the phone immediately." Vincent Whitmore Jr. had built his reputation on never losing his composure, but when he arrived at his son's penthouse 2 hours later, his usually perfect appearance showed cracks that revealed the pressure beneath. His silver hair was disheveled, his tie slightly askew, and his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he poured himself a drink without being offered one. "Explain to me," the elder Whitmore said, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man accustomed to absolute authority, "how our entire empire is collapsing because you decided to have a philosophical discussion with the night janitor." Vincent recounted the previous evening's events with the mechanical precision of someone reciting their own execution order. With each detail, his father's expression grew darker, the implications cascading through a mind that had spent decades navigating corporate warfare and political manipulation. "Marcus Chen," Whitmore Jr. repeated slowly. "Chen Digital Media Group. I remember that acquisition. Clean transaction. Seller was motivated. No complications." He paused, his face pale. "You're telling me we've been paying rent to the man we bought the company from? That he's been working in our building with access to our offices for 15 years? Vincent nodded miserably. "He owns 15 buildings in Manhattan, plus properties overseas." The sale wasn't because he needed money. It was because he was planning something. Whitmore Jr. walked to the window, staring out at the city his family had helped shape for 3 generations. The Chen family. I should have recognized the name immediately. His voice took on a quality that Vincent had never heard before, something between regret and fear. Your great-grandfather told me stories about old Chen, the Chinese miner who claimed we had cheated him out of his gold strike. Ancient history, I always thought. 70 years in the past. What really happened? Vincent asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. His father was quiet for a long time, the weight of generational secrets pressing down on him like a physical force. Your great-grandfather was a ruthless man, son. Brilliant, driven, but ruthless. When he found out that Chen had struck gold in the Sierra Nevada foothills, he used forged documents to claim the land was already owned by a company he controlled. Chen fought it in court for years, lost everything paying lawyers who were never going to win against a system that didn't value Chinese testimony. Vincent felt sick. And grandfather? Chen's son had built a small newspaper chain by the 1950s, serving the Chinese American community in California. Good little business, growing fast. Your grandfather destroyed it by creating fake evidence of communist sympathies during the McCarthy era. Chen's son lost everything, was nearly deported. Whitmore Jr.'s voice was flat, emotionless. We told ourselves it was just business. The pattern was becoming clear. Each generation of Whitmore systematically destroying each generation of Chen's, using whatever tools were available to maintain their advantage. Vincent understood now that Marcus's 15-year infiltration hadn't been motivated by simple greed or even ordinary revenge. It had been the culmination of a multi-generational war that his family had started and forgotten. And father? What did he do to Marcus's generation? Whitmore Jr. turned from the window, his face aged years in the span of an hour. Corporate espionage, mostly. When Chen Digital started gaining market share in the Asian markets, your father hired investigators to dig up dirt on their operations. When that didn't work, he planted false stories about their financial stability, triggered bank runs on their credit lines. Standard competitive practices for the time. Vincent stared at his father in horror. Standard practices? You systematically destroyed 3 generations of the same family, and you call it standard practices? It was a different era, Whitmore Jr. said defensively. Business was conducted differently then. We did what we had to do to protect our interests. The conversation was interrupted by Vincent's phone buzzing with an urgent text from Sandra. Turn on Channel 7 immediately. Emergency broadcast. Vincent grabbed the remote with shaking hands, switching to the local news station. The anchor, a woman Vincent recognized from various social functions, wore the expression of someone delivering news that would reshape the media landscape. We're following breaking developments in what authorities are calling one of the largest corporate fraud investigations in New York history. Whitmore Industries, the media conglomerate controlled by the politically connected Whitmore family, is facing federal criminal charges related to decades of alleged market manipulation, bribery, and tax evasion. The screen filled with images of FBI agents carrying boxes from Whitmore Industries headquarters, the building that Marcus Chen owned. Vincent noted the bitter irony that federal agents were seizing evidence from a building owned by the man who had provided that evidence in the first place. Perhaps most damaging to the Whitmore family's reputation, the anchor continued, are recordings that appear to capture current company chairman Vincent Whitmore Jr. discussing illegal payments to Senator Richard Morrison in exchange for favorable votes on media regulation bills. The senator's office has announced his immediate resignation from the Senate Commerce Committee. The broadcast switched to audio that made Vincent feel like he was witnessing his family's execution, his father's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing payment schedules and offshore accounts with the casual tone of someone ordering lunch. The conversation had apparently taken place in Whitmore Jr.'s private office, a room that was supposed to be electronically swept for surveillance devices monthly. How is this possible? Whitmore Jr. asked, his voice barely audible. That office is supposed to be secure. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on counter-surveillance. Vincent remembered Marcus's words about being invisible, about having access that no one suspected. He wasn't just cleaning our offices, father. He was studying them, learning them, finding ways to penetrate security that we never imagined because we never considered the cleaning staff a threat. The news broadcast continued with devastating efficiency, financial records showing systematic tax evasion dating back 20 years, evidence of market manipulation that had artificially inflated Whitmore Industries' stock price while driving competitors into bankruptcy, detailed documentation of bribes paid to city officials for favorable zoning decisions. But the most damaging revelations were yet to come. The anchor's expression grew even more grave as she introduced the next segment. Channel 7 has also obtained exclusive access to what appears to be a comprehensive dossier detailing the Whitmore family's business practices spanning 3 generations. According to these documents, the family fortune was allegedly built on a pattern of fraud, theft, and systematic exploitation of regulatory loopholes. The screen filled with historical documents, photographs, and financial records that Vincent had never seen before. Marcus had somehow obtained evidence of crimes that predated his birth, family secrets that Vincent had assumed were buried forever. The dossier includes evidence suggesting that the Whitmore family's original fortune was obtained through fraudulent land claims in California during the 1950s, targeting Chinese immigrant minors who had limited legal recourse. Subsequent generations allegedly expanded this fortune through systematic destruction of minority-owned businesses, using both legal manipulation and illegal surveillance. Vincent felt his legs give out. He sank into the nearest chair as the full scope of his family's exposure became clear. This wasn't just about current financial crimes. It was about the complete destruction of the Whitmore legacy, the revelation that their entire fortune had been built on exploitation and theft. The broadcast concluded with a statement that made Vincent's blood run cold. The investigation is being led by federal prosecutor Amanda Chen Morrison, daughter of former media executive Marcus Chen. Morrison has recused herself from direct involvement in the case, but has stated that justice delayed is not justice denied. Vincent looked at his father, who had gone completely pale. Marcus's daughter is a federal prosecutor. Whitmore Jr. nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Morrison, she must have married young, changed her name. We never made the connection. The scope of Marcus's planning was becoming clear. He hadn't just spent 15 years gathering evidence. He had positioned his own daughter within the federal prosecutor's office, ensuring that when the time came, the investigation would be handled by someone with both the skill and motivation to see it through to its conclusion. Vincent's phone rang. The caller ID showed his lawyer's office, but when he answered, it wasn't his lawyer's voice he heard. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. This is Marcus Chen." Vincent felt his mouth go dry. "How did you get this number?" "I've had access to your complete communications network for years," Marcus replied calmly. "Phone records, emails, text messages. Your security was impressive against external threats, but you never considered internal ones. What do you want?" Vincent asked, though he knew the answer. "I want to offer you a choice," Marcus said. "The same choice your family offered mine 3 times over the past 70 years. You can fight this and lose everything slowly, publicly, through years of legal proceedings that will destroy not just your wealth but your reputation, your freedom, and your family's name. Or you can accept the inevitable and minimize the damage." Vincent looked at his father, who was listening intently to the one-sided conversation. "What kind of minimizing?" "Complete divestiture of all Whitmore Industries assets to a trust fund that will be administered for the benefit of the communities your family has exploited over the past 70 years. Immediate resignation from all corporate and charitable board positions. Cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences." The offer was surrender disguised as negotiation. Vincent understood that Marcus was providing the illusion of choice while holding all the actual power. "And if we refuse?" Marcus's laugh was soft but chilling. "Then the recordings I release tomorrow will be much more interesting. Your father's conversation with Senator Morrison was actually quite restrained compared to some of the other discussions I've captured over the years. Did you know your cousin Bradley's drug trafficking operation has been funding your offshore accounts for 6 years?" Vincent felt the room spinning. Bradley Whitmore ran the family's European operations and had always been scrupulously legitimate, or so Vincent had believed. The suggestion that drug money had been flowing through Whitmore Industries opened up possibilities for criminal liability that went far beyond financial fraud. "You have 24 hours to decide," Marcus continued. "After that, the choice will be made for you." The line went dead, leaving Vincent and his father in silence, broken only by the continuing news coverage of their family's destruction. The investigation was moving with unprecedented speed, suggesting coordination between multiple federal agencies that typically took months to achieve such cooperation. Whitmore Jr. poured himself another drink with hands that shook visibly. 70 years, he said quietly. He waited 70 years for this moment. 3 generations of planning, Vincent replied. The scope of Marcus's patience finally becoming clear. He didn't just want revenge against father or grandfather. He wanted to destroy the entire bloodline, to erase everything we built. Everything we stole, Whitmore Jr. corrected, a note of bitter honesty creeping into his voice. Let's be clear about what we actually built, son. Our fortune was never legitimate. We just convinced ourselves it was. Vincent looked around his penthouse, at the artifacts of wealth that had defined his identity since birth. In 24 hours, none of it would belong to him. The Whitmore name, which had commanded respect and fear in equal measure for 3 generations, would become synonymous with corruption and theft. "There's something else," Whitmore Jr. said, his voice barely audible. "Something I never told you about your great-grandfather's original crime against the Chen family." Vincent waited, sensing that whatever his father was about to reveal would complete the picture of their family's culpability. "The gold mine that your great-grandfather stole? It wasn't just valuable because of the gold. Chen had discovered something else in those mountains. Something that would have made his family one of the wealthiest in America." "What kind of something?" Whitmore Jr. walked to his briefcase and withdrew a yellow document, its edges brittle with age. "Mineral rights to what turned out to be one of the largest rare earth element deposits in North America. Your great-grandfather thought he was stealing a gold mine. He actually stole the foundation of what would become a trillion-dollar industry." Vincent stared at the document, understanding finally dawning. The rare earth elements essential to modern electronics, computer chips, and renewable energy technology had been sitting in mountains owned by the Chen family. The Whitmores hadn't just stolen a gold mine. They had stolen the future. "Marcus knows," Whitmore Jr. continued. "When he sold Chen Digital Media Group, he retained the mineral rights to the original family claim. The same claim your great-grandfather stole through forged documents. Legally, those rights should have belonged to the Chen family for the past 70 years. The scope of the theft was staggering. Not just the original gold, not just the 3 generations of systematic destruction, but decades of profits from rare earth mining that should have belonged to Marcus's family. The compound interest on 70 years of stolen wealth was incalculable. He's not just bankrupting us, Vincent realized. He's claiming everything we should never have had in the first place." The news coverage continued throughout the day, each revelation more damaging than the last. By evening, Whitmore Industries stock had lost 80% of its value. Major advertisers were pulling contracts. Congressional leaders were calling for investigations. The family's charitable foundation was being audited by the IRS. But the most devastating blow came in the form of a civil lawsuit filed simultaneously in federal court and international tribunals. Marcus Chen, representing the estates of his grandfather and father, was claiming damages for 70 years of stolen profits, fraudulent business practices, and systematic destruction of his family's enterprises. The lawsuit included a calculation that made Vincent's head spin, adjusted for inflation, compound interest, and lost opportunities. The Chen family was seeking recovery of $47 billion, effectively everything the Whitmore family had ever accumulated, plus punitive damages that would ensure they could never rebuild. Vincent sat in his father's study that evening, surrounded by law books and legal documents that represented their family's desperate attempts to find loopholes that didn't exist. Every angle they explored led back to the same conclusion. Marcus had built an airtight case using their own records, their own words, their own admissions of guilt captured over 15 years of invisible surveillance. "I need to ask you something," Vincent said, looking at his father across the mahogany desk that had belonged to 3 generations of Whitmores. "When you were running the company, when you made the decisions that destroyed Marcus's business, did you ever consider that he might have children? That what you were doing might affect future generations?" Whitmore Jr. was quiet for a long time, staring at a photograph on his desk that showed 4 generations of Whitmore men standing in front of their original newspaper office. "No," he said finally. "I thought about our family, our legacy, our future. I never considered that other families might have legacies worth preserving, too." The admission hung in the air between them, a recognition of the moral blindness that had characterized their family's approach to business for 70 years. They had treated other people's lives as obstacles to be removed rather than as valuable in their own right. "Do you think he'll actually go through with it?" Vincent asked. "Complete destruction of everything we've built?" His father looked up from the photograph, his expression carrying the weight of a man who finally understood the true cost of his choices. "Son, if our family had spent 70 years systematically destroying his family, if we had stolen everything they should have inherited and then made them watch while we built an empire on their stolen wealth, what would you do?" Vincent considered the question seriously, imagining himself in Marcus's position, watching his grandfather die poor because of forged documents, seeing his father's business destroyed by manufactured scandals, having his own company attacked through corporate espionage and market manipulation, spending 15 years in invisible poverty while the thieves lived in luxury built on his family's stolen future. "I would want complete and total revenge," Vincent admitted. "I would want to take everything they had and make sure they could never rebuild." "Then you understand Marcus Chen perfectly," Whitmore Jr. said. "He's not just seeking justice, he's seeking the complete reversal of everything our family did to his. We made them poor, he's making us poor. We destroyed their reputation, he's destroying ours. We took their future, he's taking ours." The phone rang at midnight. Vincent answered to find Marcus's voice, calm and patient as always. "Have you made your decision, Mr. Whitmore?" Vincent looked around the study, at the portraits of ancestors who had built their fortune on theft and exploitation, at the law books that couldn't save them from the consequences of their family's choices, at his father who sat defeated in the chair that had once symbolized absolute power. "We'll cooperate," Vincent said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "Complete divestiture, resignation from all positions, cooperation with federal investigators." "I'm pleased to hear that," Marcus replied. "It will make the transition much smoother for everyone involved." "The transition to what?" "To justice, Mr. Whitmore. For the first time in 70 years, the Chen family will receive what was always rightfully ours, and the Whitmore family will experience what it feels like to have everything taken away by people who consider you too insignificant to matter." Vincent understood that this was more than just the reversal of fortune. It was poetic justice on a scale that spanned generations. The complete inversion of everything his family had believed about their place in the world's natural order. "There is one thing I'm curious about," Vincent said. "Why did you spend 15 years working as a janitor? You had the resources to destroy us through conventional means. Why the elaborate infiltration?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quality that Vincent had never heard before. "Because I wanted to understand you, Mr. Whitmore. I wanted to see how people with unlimited wealth and power behaved when they thought no one important was watching. I wanted to witness the casual cruelty, the thoughtless privilege, the complete lack of empathy that made it possible for your family to destroy mine without a second thought." The explanation was more chilling than simple revenge. Marcus hadn't just wanted to bankrupt the Whitmores, he had wanted to study them, to understand the psychological mechanisms that allowed such systematic exploitation to continue across generations. "And what did you learn?" "I learned that your family's greatest weakness was also its greatest strength, the absolute certainty that you were superior to everyone around you. That certainty made you careless, made you sloppy, made you ignore threats that you considered beneath your notice. It also made it possible for you to commit crimes that would have been unthinkable to people with functioning consciences." Vincent felt the weight of that judgment. Marcus had spent 15 years documenting not just their financial crimes, but their moral failures, their complete inability to see other people as fully human. "The recording equipment you used," Vincent said. "How did you manage to penetrate our security?" Marcus laughed softly. "Mr. Whitmore, you spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on counter-surveillance systems designed to detect external threats. But you never considered that the threat might come from someone who had legitimate access to your offices every night for 15 years. Someone who could study your security systems at leisure, learn their weaknesses, and install his own equipment during routine maintenance. The scope of the infiltration was staggering. Marcus had turned the Whitmores' own building into a surveillance center, using their assumptions about class and social hierarchy to render himself completely invisible while documenting every detail of their criminal enterprise. Tomorrow morning, Marcus continued, federal agents will arrive to take possession of all Whitmore Industries assets. You and your father will surrender yourselves to federal marshals at 9 a.m. sharp. Your cooperation agreement has already been filed with the court. Vincent felt the last vestiges of his old life slip away. By tomorrow evening, he would be in federal custody, facing charges that would likely result in decades in prison. Everything he had inherited, everything he had believed about his place in the world, would be gone. Mr. Chen, Vincent said, using Marcus's proper title for the first time. I need you to know that I understand why you did this. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for mercy. But I need you to know that I finally understand the scope of what my family took from yours. Understanding is not the same as justice, Mr. Whitmore, Marcus replied, but it's a beginning. Perhaps your children will learn from your example. Perhaps they'll understand that actions have consequences, even if those consequences take 70 years to manifest. The line went dead, leaving Vincent alone in the study that would soon belong to someone else. He looked at the portraits of his ancestors, men who had built an empire on theft and convinced themselves they were titans of industry. Tomorrow, their crimes would be front-page news around the world. Vincent walked to the window and looked out at Manhattan, the city his family had helped shape for 3 generations. Somewhere in those glittering towers, Marcus Chen was probably sitting in his own office, finally able to claim the justice that had been denied to his family for 70 years. The janitor's response to being mocked as too poor to read had indeed bankrupted the entire Whitmore bloodline. But Vincent understood now that it had never really been about the books or the mocking or even the money. It had been about a debt that had been accumulating interest for 70 years, and a man patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment to collect. As dawn broke over the city, Vincent Whitmore III prepared to surrender everything his family had stolen and face the consequences of crimes he had inherited along with his fortune. The Whitmore empire was ending not with the dramatic collapse of a stock market crash or the violence of a corporate raid, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent 15 years pushing a mop and waiting for justice to finally be served. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.